Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And today I actually have a very special guest. Now, I saw my guest speak about a month ago or so, and it completely blew my mind, the topic. And so I've got a million questions, and I think you're going to really be interested in this. Today I'm talking with Dr. Michael Klipstein. He is the he's with former Cyber Command, former NSA, former cyber advisor for the US Army, as well as White House National Security Counsel and Director of National Security Policy. But now he is the Senior Public Policy Advisor in regards to cyber and space at Baker Donelson. And that's what I want to talk about today is outer space. And from what I understood from your presentation, and thank you for being here very, very much, the laws in outer space when it comes to things like cyber warfare or actual kinetic warfare are quite different than they are here on Earth. And can you kind of explain that as a primer for my audience?
Sure. Thank you, Nick, for having me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity. So, on land, we have maritime law, we have laws for each nation, we have international laws, but in space, we have a lot of different things. We have international treaties. And so these treaties are not what we normally think of going through Congress and such like that, where it binds the United States. They came from the United Nations. The foundational document is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and it says what nations will or will not do in space. And so one of the things was what will not militarize the moon, as we are starting to see that happening now. But more importantly, there is a convention of liabilities. Who's held responsible for things going wrong that came in 1972?
Hmm.
And so an example of that is SpaceX back in June of last year had a launch of a bunch of small form satellites.
Mhm.
And so they lost control of the orbital transfer vehicle. For lack of a better term, it started wobbling, permutations in space. And so they had to eject them all early in order to try to save them.
Hmm.
Now, luckily, none of those small satellites hit anything else in space because things move pretty quickly in space to stay in orbit. Now, if that orbital transfer vehicle, when they launched those satellites early, would have hit another satellite from another nation, two things would have occurred. One, the United States would have been held responsible and liable because SpaceX is not a member of the treaty, and no U.S. laws pass responsibility down to a corporation.
Hmm.
Two, depending on who that is, that could have been considered an act of war. In some ways, space is more the Wild West than the internet is.
Hmm. So if I'm hearing you right, and I want to make sure I'm understanding this for my audience, if I'm Elon Musk and I'm shooting rockets, or excuse me, rockets into space to deploy satellites, and that rocket accidentally hits a Chinese satellite, or my satellite bumps into a Chinese satellite, or a Russian, or take your pick, technically the Chinese could declare an act of war on the United States.
As the rules and laws are written right now, yes.
Oh, that's a lot of power for that guy. So my question then becomes, and one of the things that you talked about was the flow down of laws. So let's say the United States gets together and says, yeah, we don't want SpaceX or a SpaceX competitor being an American-based corporation to accidentally cause an international incident in outer space, and so we're going to flow that down. So let's say in that hypothetical situation that a rocket from SpaceX, we'll just use SpaceX, hits that Chinese satellite. Let's say the United States comes out and says, we're sorry, but hey, it's on Elon Musk. Go ahead and sue them. Or I mean, China can't invade SpaceX, right?
Yeah.
So how would the international law work in terms of recognition? I mean, China or anybody would have to be on board with a unified understanding that a private corporation now has liability as opposed to the government that they sit under.
Now, this is part of the foundational problem that we were talking about just a moment ago,
Mm.
because this is meant for nations. And so when you start looking at the flow of information and the responsibility, neither the Outer Space Treaty or the Convention of Liabilities ever envisioned commercial space. It was always
Mm.
the it was always the domain of nation states. Now, China can hold the United States financially responsible at a bare minimum, and that's agreed to by law.
Mm.
That Outer Space Treaty and Convention of Liabilities. So the United States would then be on the hook for however millions of dollars it takes to replace that satellite, launch that satellite, the intellectual property, etc.
Mm.
Technically, it could be considered an act of war. I don't know if China would go that far or not, but technically, it could be construed as an act of war.
Hmm. So, in that vein, as you're looking at that in terms of active war, what is the common framework that would necessarily prevent that? And now, what I mean by that is, in order to cause a war, you would hope that a nation would recognize the intent of another nation, right?
Agreed.
Like SpaceX, for example, isn't saying we're going to start an international incident. We hope so. We don't think Elon Musk is a Bond villain, but it depends on who you ask, right? And so, by virtue of that, if that were to happen, we'd have to imagine that it's an accident. I think it would be universally understood that was an accident that caused this damage. And so, given the understanding that and if you're looking at criminal law, for example, it really comes down to intent. And if they had that intent, that's one thing, but odds are the intent is otherwise. Does that play or weigh into this in any way, shape, or form?
Absolutely. Intent is a huge thing. There's a difference between accidents and malicious intent. Now, the converse of that is sticking with Elon Musk, just as the example, he also owns Starlink. And so when the United States came to the aid of Ukraine, Elon made the unilateral decision to support Ukraine with Starlink terminals. And so, because of that, it became a weird gray area. So, Russia said they have become a legitimate military target because they're aiding our enemy. The United States kind of got put into a really tricky situation then at that particular point because are they a military target? Yes or no? Are they a part of the Department of Defense? No. Well, we started then contracting through Starlink to give aid to them. So, does that make them a legitimate target? And so, again, I agree. It comes down to intent, but depending on how you slice it, you could potentially squeeze intent out of it, especially when we start talking about Starlink and dual military uses.
hmm Yeah, well, and I mean, the only thing I can equate to that off the top of my head is, the Ford Motor Company, built tanks, for the Allies, for the U.S. Army in World War II. Do the Germans specifically declare war on Ford when they've already declared war on the United States, or can they do that?
True, but let me push back ever so slightly.
Sure.
Ford Motor Company, yes, produced tanks. Ford Motor Company was not a legitimate actor in a direct aid to an adversary at that particular point, unlike what Starlink was for command and control of the Ukrainian government.
Hmm. So Ford building, just to be clear, Ford building tanks for the United States military would not be aid of the United States military or the aid of the United States?
They weren't for lack of a better term, a direct, not belligerent, but a direct enabler of an adversary.
I see. I see. So that actually then opens up another can of worms on
Yeah,
two different
absolutely.
sides. First one is on the Ukraine side because Elon Musk famously said, "Hey, free of charge, we're giving Starlink over to the Ukrainians." The Ukrainians were, from what I understand, in the process of basically coordinating a very intricate attack as a counter response to the Russian invasion and all of that. And then Elon Musk just basically pulled the rug out from under them and said, "Hey, we're no longer giving this to you for free," and shut off satellite service in a war, which also I think begs the understanding of technically he has a legal right to do that, but that's obviously a lot of power for one individual. And I don't necessarily know if space law can enforce him keeping it on for the Ukrainians, because I don't know if the Ukrainians have presence in space or if that is even relevant.
I don't think it's relevant for one. The other part of it is still a private corporation. Now, the bigger problem is Elon Musk as an individual is making geopolitical decisions at that particular point,
Right.
as in trying to, and I'm not saying he's trying to enforce policy or create a policy, but
Mhm.
inadvertently that's what occurred. He made a policy for the United States at that particular point as a U.S. company, which
Right.
puts the United States into a tricky situation.
Right. Well, so then that then begs the question of US law. Can the United States or should the United States make laws that govern basically the Starlinks of the world? So, in other words, Elon Musk cannot commit to the Ukraine with, let's say, out without the permission of the U.S. government because that's where Starlink is based, and therefore, if he is committing, the United States government has to enforce that he's not going to turn it off. Those kinds of things.
Or the other option is he gets viewed as a private military contractor, similar to what used to be called Blackwater and Wagner Group and some of these others that go it alone and don't have nation state support or protection.
Okay. And then that's very valid. I didn't even think of that. Now, the other side of the Ukraine war, which I think would actually be really interesting, is we have seen hacking groups that have claimed since the beginning of the war that they've been able to hack into Russian satellite infrastructure and essentially knock out their spy satellites, all that kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are hitting the satellites directly so much as they might be hitting terrestrial land stations that are controlling the satellites and then reprogramming the satellites remotely, something along those lines. I'm not 100% sure, and I've never been able to get a straight answer on that and as much research as I've done. But in terms of something along those lines, what are the implications in space for that in terms of the law and the framework?
So for a satellite, you got to remember it broadcasts over a wide swath of Earth at any one time. It's not a point-to-point transmission like what we have with microwave antennas and stuff like that. I say that because there's a group called SatNogs out there, if you can Google them. And so basically, one of their stated goals is to decrypt every piece of uh, transmission that comes from outer space to and from outer space. And if they can't decrypt it right now, they put it off to the side in a database and come back at it later to try to decrypt everything. Um, Part of the problem with satellites is they were never meant to be secure, they were meant to last. And so when we start looking at the CIA triad, availability got put above confidentiality or integrity of the data that was coming up or down to those satellites.
Hmm.
That there that poses a huge problem because how do I ensure that yes, it's there, but how do I ensure that I can actually connect to it? How do I ensure that the data coming to and from it is actually what it's intended to be? There lies the problem. We're trying to get at some of that stuff now. Now, NIST in the last year put out a couple of small SPs for hybrid satellites, small form satellites, et cetera, like that. But there's really no recognized global standards for satellite communications to protect the data for encryption or whatever the case may be because of the distance. It's long been the idea or belief that because I launch it and its geo is roughly 22,000 miles away, no one's ever going to get to it again. Those days are
Hmm.
gone.
Right.
Somebody with a decent technical background, a decent antenna, and a decent transmitter can actually touch those satellites. Now,
Hmm.
whether they get into them or not is another story. But that's not even considering the supply chain problems of where all those components come from around the world.
Right, right. Well, I mean, and I think that's a really good point. You know, as you're looking at international standards for things like cryptography and all of that, we have those standards out there. So FIPS, for example, FIPS
Mhm.
140-2, encryption here in the United States. But what you're saying is, as this traffic is passing through, there's no real standard that we have right now for that. Meaning, you've got a whole bunch of governments putting up a whole bunch of satellites, and they may or may not be as secure as they need to be. And so by virtue of that, that I think opens up the other question is as the sky becomes more cluttered with these things, one, do you see an increasing improvement in, let's say, cryptography or defense of satellites? What does that look like? And also, as we continue to add, because Starlink wants to add another, what, 50,000 satellites in orbit. Their competitors want to do another 30 to 50,000. We are basically blanketing the planet. And obviously, the upside is the internet can reach places that it previously couldn't. I could be on the side of Mount Everest and check Google, right? And that's something that you just wouldn't have thought of 10, 20 years ago. But are we going to be bumping around up there left and right? And by virtue of that, are we causing international incident after international incident if we simply haven't accounted for the privatization? Right. And I have to imagine back in the 60s when all of this started, they weren't thinking a private corporation would probably have the money and resources to be able to do this, but here we are.
So this is one of the problems NASA and other space agencies are looking at right now. It's called ADR, active debris removal. So
Mm.
things that are no longer useful, dead satellites, set rocket components, whatever the case may be. How do we clear junk, for lack of a better term, trash out of space so it doesn't cause problems? How do we deconflict who has what spots? Now, some of this is done. So for geosynchronous, those slots are closely guarded and assigned. Leo and Mio, different stories. If you can put it up there, congratulations. It's more of a wild west. Going back to what I was saying earlier
Mm.
about comparing the space to the internet.
Okay. So, I mean, and I think that just opens up a can of worms. Do you know, and maybe you do, obviously, given your position at Baker Donaldson and all of this, is there a new space treaty at work, for this?
So I've talked to many people across the international community, and the problem with this is these treaties would have to go through the United Nations.
Hmm.
And so getting the United Nations to do anything, if you look back on some of their stuff for cybersecurity, if you look back on even recent events trying to condemn actions in the Middle East or other places in the world, can you get a consensus out of any one group at any one time? Probably the answer is no. So getting something to move forward for the security of satellites is going to be a big rock to push up a big hill.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, to that point, the United Nations, for all the good it does in terms of its premise and everything else, it really doesn't have a lot of teeth.
No,
Be aware of my non-binding resolution,
exactly.
and
That's
all of that.
bad. To stop it.
Right, right. And there's at some point, you got to slap the kid's wrist away from the cookie jar, and they just don't really have that. And to that point, we have an anti-hacking treaty here, across the globe that multiple countries have signed. I believe I asked you this question like a month ago. Now that
Right.
I'm thinking about it, the United States has signed it, and a whole bunch of smaller countries like Colombia, for example, which does not have a huge presence in hacking, but nevertheless has signed on. Canada, et cetera, et cetera. But
Exactly.
noticeably absent is Russia and China. And so
Exactly.
let's project that into space as we're looking at the next 10, 20, 30 years of China rising, Russia doing whatever Russia's going to do, not to mention anybody that we would consider adversarial, and God forbid there's North Korean satellites everywhere too. What does that look like if, let's say, the world agrees, minus China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, etc., to say, hey, yeah, we're all in this together and accidents happen, but these countries will make a mountain out of a molehill if, here we are, SpaceX crashes into something.
I think there's a way to get around this. You have to build a coalition of like-minded nations to get around some of this. Uh, I was talking to a company who shall remain unnamed last week at the Satellite 2024 convention or conference in DC,
Mhm.
and they brought up a very valid point. Because some of these profits are razor thin for these large corporations to put the research R&D into and manufacturing into a satellite, especially for the federal government,
Mhm.
why isn't the federal government mandating this stuff in their contracts and putting it out in their request for proposals? That has to go first. And so you need nations to actually put that into their design parameters when they put out the RFPs so that this stuff will actually get incorporated in from day one. And so these like minded nations can come together and say, okay, this version of encryption is the one we're going to use, and it seems to be pretty strong and resilient to latency from a satellite, et cetera.
Mhm.
And so at that particular point, you can build an informal standard, for lack of a better term, to get around some of this stuff. And the nations that don't wish to participate, that's on them at that particular point. But AES, to use a computer network example,
Mhm.
was never formalized as the encryption standard that everyone will use, but everyone uses it. And
Right.
so,
Right.
how do you get around this? Um, Thinking back years ago, we need to also design the all three, this confidentiality, integrity, and availability into these systems when we put out the request for proposals as well.
Right.
Years ago, telecommunication satellites, the second they had any degradation, would default to essentially plain text, no encryption, whatever the case would be, because it was about delivering a service, not necessarily the integrity or the confidentiality of that service.
Right, right. Well, and then that speaks, I think, to the greater issue, a greater issue in the sense that it ties into, I think, what we're seeing right now, which is the rise of commercially available artificial intelligence, which
Mm-hmm.
means that the next generation of satellites, essentially, when it comes to either maneuvering or handling data or whatever they're doing in terms of processing, are going to be integrating artificial intelligence, into
Absolutely.
them. And so if I'm looking at the next 5 to 10 years and I'm asking you this question because you're the expert, not me, as we continue to improve and harden artificial intelligence, not just for cybersecurity purposes, but for processing, for having it do whatever we want it to do, what do you think that's going to look like in space when we're talking about these treaties or lack thereof, or space travel, or just the satellites around orbit? How are we going to be able to coordinate that when they can think on their own and position accordingly?
So what scares me even more about that is going to the art world, looking at nightshades, where you can poison the data for AI. And so that's what scares
Mm,
me even more.
mm,
And the art world, digital art, is using that now to prevent somebody from stealing their data and using it to replicate. Since Patent Office and the Supreme Court both said you can't copyright or trademark some of this AI generated art.
mm,
So what do? They poison the data so that you cannot replicate it. That's what scares me more. And I see that becoming more prevalent across the space ecosystem as well. Also, we're starting to see AI being used for generating efficiencies in space, how to transfer from one orbit to another and burn the minimum amount of fuel, taking advantage of solar winds, velocity, etc.
mm,
We're starting to see all that come to fruition now. Poisoning the data is what scares me the most.
mm. So in that vein, and again, not trying to jump gears, but I know I've got you for a finite amount of time here. One of the things that you started with is that, and when we first started talking, is you mentioned that there is the militarization of the moon. Can you explain exactly what's going on with that?
So China has already said point blank out front that they are going to put bases on the moon. They want to mine the resources. They want to develop, a, for lack of a better term, a small colony, and they plan on protecting their mineral rights as they see them and their land usage rights as they see them through a military context. For a lack of a better term, if anybody's seen the show For All Mankind, it's strange how fiction is starting to emulate real life. It just fiction's gotten ahead of it. So,
Well, I was thinking of the old conspiracy theory of the Nazi moon base, but that works. And I also saw that episode of Space Force as well with Steve Carell
well, yes.
on Netflix, so but yeah, I mean that, and I think that's a deep issue, that we have to contend with as well. In the same way that, we got a report a couple months ago that the Russians were thinking about, nukes in space, right? Building weapons platforms and all of that. And right now it doesn't seem like we have any real treaties that will prevent that, or we do and they just don't care.
No, we don't have any treaties that prevent that. But if you look back into American history, that was one of the great coups by Reagan to get the Russians to spend all their money and basically ruin their economy with
Mhm.
Strategic Defense Initiative, which was
Right.
nukes in space or defeating nukes in space.
Right, right, right. And that's why he pulled out of Reykjavik, and that's just a very interesting aspect of history. And so with that, I've got one more critical question that may open up other questions. But
Sure.
if we're having this conversation on April 1st, and no fools here, just April 1st, 2034, what's that going to be? What's going to happen in the next 10 years that we're going to be discussing that hasn't happened yet? Or what do you think the next 10 years are going to look like?
I think one of the big things we're going to start seeing is more commercialization of space. And I
Oh
say
yeah.
that because, hear me out. In 1955, Eisenhower announced the interstate highway system.
Right.
And so part of that was there would be a gas station every 5-ish miles. There would be service stations. There would be all these things to make travel across the United States more easy and enjoyable for the average person. You're going to see something very similar in space. Uh, two years ago, NASA put out their space superhighway concept, where
Mhm.
there would be service stations in space, and so those service stations would be able to refuel, refit, or repair satellites. You would
Mhm.
have the ability to do 3D printing in space. So long gone are the days of folding things up in an origami shape, putting them into a space shuttle or another rocket and launching them into space and unfolding them on the moon or in space. If we're going to actually put a habitat on space in space, whether that's on the moon or Mars eventually, we need to take materials with us to be able to fabricate things, whether that's the initial habitat whether that's repair, whatever the case may be. You're going to see an analog of the Eisenhower interstate system put into space.
Hmm. And I think that's really interesting. I also recently read an article where there's now a company that's basically doing pharmaceutical in space,
Yes.
that they manufactured a small batch of narcotics and all of that. I did a video on that a couple of days ago called "Drugs in Space." Made a couple of references to Snoop Dogg, but because hey, why not? But I think it's interesting. Now, that I think is the commercialization, the expansion of humanity into space. But when we are looking at it from the framework of governance or the framework of laws, where now we're going to have a whole bunch more private corporations doing a whole bunch more different things across the spectrum, and we still don't have anything that says that pharmaceutical spaceship or whatever accidentally bumps into the Chinese satellite or whatever.
Yeah.
What does that look like in the next 10 years? Do you think we can get some kind of working understanding and agreement as space becomes more crowded?
I hope so, because right now the closest analog we have is maritime law, and it's not a good analog. And so,
Mm.
unfortunately, we try to put bad analogies against things and hope that they will fit. I don't know how many times I've seen non cyber people or non space people using bad football analogies, other sports, whatever the case may be. But right now, we need to have a group of experts in the room and have a serious conversation of what does this look like. I hope the United Nations can do something in the next 10 years to answer your question. I don't have a lot of faith in humanity at this particular point. And so I think, unfortunately, I think something bad is going to have to happen. Now, what's the scale of bad? Hopefully not an act of war, but I think something is going to have to happen to force the conversation, because it's not going to happen on its own.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. I really hope that, the better angels prevail in terms of humanity, and we're able to get on the same page, even if we disagree on everything. At least have an agreement that we shouldn't start shooting at each other,
Exactly.
in orbit. And I think that's an important one. And so with that, I'll leave it there. And Mike, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to, follow your work or learn more about this, how can they follow you? Where should they go?
Best place is LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. All right. So please go connect to Mike on LinkedIn. So Dr. Michael Klipstein, amazing resume. Thank you very much for your time today. And I think my audience is a lot more prepared for what they might see overhead.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
again, Nick.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Here.